Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And on this podcast, I talk with my friends who love Jesus, and we together try to make sense of this world. And my guest for this episode is a friend who has been helping many people over many years make sense of the world. He's Pete Wehner. He's a writer for The Atlantic, for the New York Times, also a senior fellow in residence with the Trinity Forum. He's the author of numerous books, most recently, The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. And Pete has actually been a previous guest on Good Faith. And one of the things that I'm really looking forward to hosting Good Faith is having recurrent guests like you, Pete. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
It's great to be with you, Curtis. I admire you and your ministry and all you've done in your life. And so it's great to have a conversation with you.
Well, Pete and I are friends who were both mentored by a same remarkable leader, a man named Steve Hayner, who since passed away. I was mentored by Steve when Steve was the president of InterVarsity, and I was a young 20-something leader in the organization. And Pete, it was amazing. Steve just sort of took me under his wing and mentored me. And then I believe Steve introduced me to you over email. But you knew Steve actually long before that. So can you remind me what your friendship with Steve was like?
Sure. Yeah, of course. He really was a remarkable person. There's so many people that I've met over the years who were mentored by Steve, which is an indication of the kind of person he was, the kind of heart he had. I met Steve when I went to University of Washington, and that was my first year freshman year was the fall of 1979. And he was the youth pastor essentially at University Presbyterian Church. And when Steve took over something called the Inn, which was a gathering of college students on Tuesday nights, I think it was at 9:00. And when it started, it was
9:00 in the evening, I assume?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Classes would have competed at 9 a.m. And when it started, there was a building at the side of the church, and I think probably around 30 people were part of the Inn. That was the early 70s. When I got there, it was about 900 students that would show up every Tuesday night. Steve would speak. There was worship music. There was communion every week. So it wasn't particularly original in terms of how the gatherings were done, but what made it magical was Steve and his ministry, both in how he spoke and in the lives that he touched. And I got to know him. I'll tell you a story about Steve, which was, I didn't know him really well. But I came to admire him just by listening to him, by seeing how I thought he modeled his life. So his whole countenance, the way he thought about things. And I felt like he was a person I could trust. And I was struggling with an issue at that time, which I never shared with anybody. And I felt like I needed to share it with somebody. And so I set up an appointment with him. It was on a Tuesday afternoon. I think it was 3:00. And I remember I was walking from the campus to UPres. I was about halfway there, and I thought, I think I'm going to turn around and just cancel this. I don't want to go forward with it. But I went ahead and I met with him, and it was a really important meeting. The things that I was struggling with turned out not to be nearly as significant as I thought, but often in life, if you're struggling with something and you're struggling with it alone, it takes a disproportionate power over your life, maybe a disproportionate fear in your life. And so I felt such a relief after that. And that really created for me a bond with Steve, because he was helpful and because he was trustworthy. And then throughout, knew him through my years at University of Washington, and then stayed in touch with him. He went on to become president of InterVarsity, later Columbia Theological Seminary. He married Cindy and me in 1995.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And here in the Washington, D.C. area. And really at every key moment in my life, I would reach out to Steve. I didn't see him often, but I stayed in touch with him. And his death in late January of 2015 was a huge loss for me, for you, and for a lot of other people. He's one of those models that I have and that I think about as I go through my life, what's right and wrong to do.
Me too. And it makes me happy to think of our commonality in Steve. One of the things I think I'm looking forward to in the resurrection is you and I reuniting with Steve and telling him, "Hey, we've become friends because of you." And I think that will make
Yeah,
Steve very happy.
yeah, amen. Well said.
Well, Pete, I wanted to have you come on to discuss a topic that I think is central to good faith. And the topic is the experience of being in exile. And so, an exile is someone who has lost their home in some way and are in a state of waiting. And the reason why I believe this topic is so central to good faith is because when I was discerning whether to continue doing this, hosting this podcast, with David leaving for the New York Times, and David will be a recurrent monthly guest, but I really had to step up to be the host of this podcast. The moment of discernment that was most crucial for me was thinking about our audience. And we get a lot of emails from our audience basically conveying some sense of homelessness. A lot of it is political homelessness. We have, I think, a disproportionate number of conservatives who feel like they don't have a political home anymore, but also some from the
Hmm.
left. Some cultural homelessness, feeling like they're looking out on the landscape of how Christians are engaged and viewed in the culture, and they feel like I don't have a home there in that landscape. Some are experiencing spiritual homelessness. They are questioning spiritual attachments or church attachments. And the vision I have of good faith is that our listeners are sort of throughout the week, like journeying and wandering or trekking through the wilderness of various sorts, political, culture, or spiritual. And I had this vision of the Good Faith podcast as like a weekly campfire where those trekking through the wilderness could at least find each other, gather around this campfire, and listen to friends talk about making sense of this world where we so often can feel homeless. And our podcast doesn't claim to have any of the answers, but we feel like we can be at least that campfire. And so I wanted to ask you, is this just a good faith thing, like that somehow this podcast has attracted like a niche audience, or does it go wider than that? Like in your experience, how widespread is this feeling of political, cultural, or even spiritual homelessness?
Yeah, that's a lovely vision of the podcast, and I think it's a necessary thing to do. And I'm not surprised what you're hearing from your listeners. I think it's widespread. I don't think it's too generous to you or to your audience. Um, I'd say that there's just empirical data for it. I mean, if sociologists have documented this, and this is a time of really unusual loneliness, isolation, despair. If you look at a lot of indicators like depression, suicide, that kind of thing, they've just been skyrocketing. I think it's most concentrated among the young, but it's certainly not exclusive to there. So the empirical data supports it, and then in my own experience, I've sensed it very much too, hearing from extended family, from friends, from pastors, and theologians. I have a lot of pastor friends that I've made over the years, and a number of them are in this area, Northern Virginia area, but also spread throughout the country. And I've been struck in my conversations with them, the feelings of exhaustion,
Yeah.
feelings of isolation, the rancor that has characterized our politics for the last decade, but particularly I would say in the last half dozen years, um, is part of it. But the political rancor and the let's call it the culture war rancor has invaded almost every nook and cranny of life, including the church, including Bible studies, including groups, and of course it's intruded in families. Families
Yeah.
have broken up over politics and cultural issues. So I think it's a very real thing, um, and people are searching around, trying to figure out what to do about it. But it exists, and we have to name it, and then we have to try and work together to figure out where we go from here.
And it does, because it's so dislocating, it does create, I think, this widespread sense of homelessness, of being somehow I'm in exile. I'm not where I feel like I have a comfortable, permanent home. And
Right.
so I wanted to discuss this experience of exile with you, Pete, specifically, because people, I think, maybe have mainly known you as a writer, may not be fully aware of your story, your professional story, because you once had a home. You made your professional home at the very center, at the very center of power in our country, because you worked in the White House as the deputy director of speechwriting in the George W. Bush administration, and later director of Office of Strategic Initiatives in the White House. So, Pete, I got to say, it's a little nutty for me to imagine that every day you were going to work in the White House and uh, writing words that would come out of the mouth of the most powerful man in the world. And I've known you for many years, but I realize I've never asked you this question, which was, what was that like? Like, what was it like to call the White House your home?
Yeah, it was, I don't think I ever lost my sense of kind of awe and wonder at working at the White House. You go in, you go through several layers of security to park there, but it just unfolds before you, and you walk the halls. And it's just it's a beautiful setting. It's obviously a historic setting. Um, and I think probably in my case, I was a pretty good student at University of Washington, political science. I wasn't top of the class Harvard, and so the idea that I would end up working in the White House is one. It's one that I, even at a young age, I thought about, because politics interested me. I would read memoirs, and I thought it would be really fascinating and interesting to be an advisor, in the White House. But it wasn't a realistic expectation, and the stars aligned the right way. I was really, really fortunate, including people who have invested in me, that allowed me to get that opportunity. So that's one thing. It was sort of the awe and the wonder of it. I was deputy director of speech writing, and I did that for 2001 and most of 2002, and was there during the 9/11. Which was obviously a traumatic event for the country, and of course, being in the White House, I'm happy to talk more about the details of that. But that was an extraordinary experience. Just trying to figure out in the aftermath of that what to do in terms of the words that were said, more broadly, the actions that were taken. But I kind of felt vulnerable as a speechwriter. I didn't feel like that was my greatest strength. I was not the best speechwriter in the White House. Mike Gerson was the head of speechwriting, and Mike was a much better, more gifted speechwriter than I. And then there were two other people that they formed a sort of troika of the team, and and part of the vulnerability is just when you're going through the process, and for presidents, it depends on the nature of the speech. If it's a really significant speech, the president's been involved and other advisors have been involved at every step of the way, sort of signing off. So by the time a speech is delivered, at least in our White House, things have been pretty well buttoned down, and you'd have to clear a pretty high bar to open up a speech. So that was a pretty orderly process. But the speeches that, the president saw the day of, like if he was going to give a law enforcement speech in Philadelphia, which wasn't going to make much news, but he was going to deliver it, and he'd see it in the morning. And you always had this fear, at least I did, that the letters POTUS, the acronym POTUS for President of the United States, would show up on your phone, and you'd have to go in and make, some last minute changes, or is he going to like the speech or not? So there was that, just from a personal level, but it was a really good team that was there within the White House. People got along, really, really, really well. And you have a sense of history, particularly after a moment like 9/11. Not every day in the White House is a significant day. It doesn't change the arc of a nation by any means, but there are moments, and 9/11 was one of those moments. When I went to become director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, which was the end of 2002 until 2007, that was a much better fit for me. I was a kind of in-house White House think tank. So I did something at present called Wehner. I began to write sort of critiques, explanations for our policies, answer critics. And I sent it out, and I had a huge gift there because I actually didn't have to clear it with anybody before I sent it out to the wider world. Sometimes I did because I wanted input or just to be safe. But for the most
I
part,
remember getting those and feeling like I was given like exclusive access into the very center of the world.
Well, it wasn't the center of the world, but it was the center of my mind anyway. And then I would also bring in, at the president's request, public intellectuals, historians, faith leaders, theologians, and others to meet with him. So these would be 90-minute meetings.
Wow.
People like Mark Knoll and historians like Michael Beschloss and authors, particularly authors of books of Lincoln, because the president, I think he read 14 biographies of Lincoln while he was president.
Yeah.
So that was a great thing, and I was also able to go in different lanes within the White House. So it was the nature of my relationship with different people. So if I had something to say to the chief of staff or deputy chief of staff, I would get a hearing. Obviously, Mike at the speechwriting office, he was my closest friend, communications department. So that one I felt more at home. And the way my wife Cindy described it is that was sort of Pete playing in a sandbox, sort of building little sand castles.
Pete, hearing you describe that, it sounds at least for many people like, oh my gosh, that is a dream job. And it's a dream job. You're at home in the White House. You're at home with comrades like the late Michael Gerson, who I know you shared a deep connection and bond with. And you get a text, or I guess on your phones, a message from POTUS saying, I need to meet with you. Like, this is a dream job to be able to call this your home. I was thinking about, that came to mind, Psalm 126, that says, when we return to the land, we were like those who dreamed. This idea that there is this longing and dream to have a place where your skills are being used, you're being recognized, you're doing your best work. It's the dream. It's our. I think it's a fundamental human dream, and it's a dream of human glory that we are in that place. So you had that, and then you didn't have that. You had to leave the administration. I don't know the exact time you left, but I assume it was right around the end of the administration.
Yeah, it was August of 2007.
Okay, so the experience of exile is once having that dream home and then losing it. That's exile. So, Pete, what was that like to lose that home?
In that case, it wasn't a particularly traumatic experience for me for a couple of reasons, I think. One was there was just a natural turning of the page. The second is that when you've been there for 7 years, you feel like you've done what you can do, and that this is a kind of parentheses of your life, at least for most of us, and also I went from the White House. Of course, I left that, and there's a sense of when you lose that, your capacity to influence events, which is what you try and do and care about. That's a nice thing to be able to do. And I'm sure there's human pride that seeps in even in ways that we don't know. It's nice to be able to say you work in the White House and you get all the the notepad that says the White House. That's kind of cool, and it's silly to deny that. But then I went to a think tank where I spent 15 years, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I was still able to write and comment on public life and public affairs. And that was important to me too. It was my ability to continue to weigh in on matters that I cared about, the world of ideas, the world of politics and culture, world of philosophy to some extent too. And so that was not shut off from me. It was almost a new chapter in an ongoing career. So I think that helped me. If I'd have had to have given up my place in public life, public discussion, and public debate, I think that would have that would have been harder. And I stayed in touch with a lot of my colleagues, in the White House. Still in touch with President Bush, whom I liked and admired very much. So there was some decompression of course, but I think I had it relatively easy, and I didn't find the longing to really go back. If Mitt Romney had won the presidency in 2012, I think I would have been asked to join. I know now Senator Romney. I'd worked the last few months on the campaign in a variety of roles. They had asked me to come on early on, and I didn't. But the summer of the election, I did, and I thought about, if he becomes president, would I go back? And I wasn't sure. Part of it was a season of life with our kids and the things that we were dealing with at that time, the age of the kids. So it really would have been a coin flip, I think, if I'd have gone back. And even in 2016, if Jeb Bush had won, it was the same thing. At that point, the kids were a little older. But for some people, there's the feeling that, that was the apex of their life. And afterward, there's a sense of loss they can never recreate it. I didn't feel that as much. I think more of my exile, Curtis, to be honest, was when I sort of broke with the Republican Party over Donald Trump. That was, I think, deeper and more fundamental than the transition from the White House. Having said that, it was still a transition. It was still something of a loss. Yeah. And you look back to those moments and think they were pretty special, in that you had a small role, in my case, a very small role, in a sort of unfolding drama of American history.
Well, I think that experience is very common. Not you're an extreme case of that with the White House, but there are many people who feel like the apex of their life was in the past. They were the star athlete in high school, and the center of the big man on campus in college, or they had in my world, somebody was a startup, center of a startup world, and hit it big and hasn't had a second act yet. Right. Or a writer who's, had that great first novel and has struggled ever since. That sense of that the apex is in the past, I think, is a very common experience. Yeah. You seem to have navigated that really well, and with sort of a sense of grace, at least up until, the Republican Party exit, which I want to talk about in a moment. But just give people who struggle with that sense of, the best is in the rear view mirror. How did you navigate it with the grace that you did? What would you advise people who struggle with that sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an important and a deep question. I mean, the reality is, I suppose, that for all of us, our best days at some point in our life are going to be behind us, right? That's right. It may be as in our profession, it may be as parents. As we grow older, we can't do the same things we did. There can be a decline, and you go back and you think about the memories of what was, and often we romanticize the past in a certain way. So how do you navigate those things? It's so much, of course, depends on facts and circumstances and individual lives. I think as a general matter, there are several things. One is to be able to name it, I think, not to deny it, not to pretend that it doesn't exist. Another thing, I think, is to be able to talk about it with trusted friends, with counselors, not just about the loss, but maybe go a layer or two deeper, which is, why is it such a loss? What does it tell me about myself that I feel that this is a great loss? Is it a sense of meaninglessness, more meaninglessness in life? Is it a sense of prestige and power that's been taken away, and that turned out to be really central to my self-understanding? Is it a feeling that I'm not contributing anymore to individual lives or to a broader effort? And so I think that's important to do, which try and locate what's the source of the grief, or what's the source of the loss. And then I think part of it is if one is able to redirect one's energy into something else that can give purpose and meaning, not necessarily to the degree that you had in the past, but that in its own right is something that's worthwhile. Last week my wife Cindy and I met with two other couples, and we talked about a essay that Winston Churchill wrote, Painting as a Pastime, which I would recommend to people. It's Churchill, so it's beautifully written, of course.
We're big Churchill fans here on the podcast.
Yeah, I bet you are. And the short version of it is he was in exile after the disaster of the Dardanelles. And there's a debate about the degree to which Churchill was responsible for what went wrong, or whether in fact his plan was right, but it was poorly executed. But in any event, he was held responsible. Churchill was a man of enormous ambition, and in his case, rightly so. He was a man of enormous talent, and he was sidelined, and he felt like his career in public life was over. And he took up painting as a hobby. And his description of what painting brought to him is really beautiful and important. Now, of course, after that, he became prime minister, and he became a heroic and central figure in the 20th century because of his role in World War II and the defeat of the Nazi regime. And then he lost, and then he won again, the prime ministership. But at the time he wrote painting as a pastime, he wasn't at that place. So there was an illustration to me and to those of us who talked about it, that he found a hobby in this case, but it was one that he invested himself into. Now, it may not be a hobby; it may be another line of work, or it may be relationships. But I think one has to, in a sense, come to an inner peace to the degree one can, that life is a series of unfolding chapters, and some are better and some are worse. And rather than longing for the past or living in the past, it's a trite phrase, but there's something to it, of course. You just need to try and live in the present and create meaning in the present. And on top of that is the importance of what we were talking about earlier, which is just a sense of community, to have people in your life who will give you meaning in your life, that can travel the journey with you. That can't be, the importance of that can't be overstated.
Pete, I love that description of the process you're describing about dealing with the loss when you're coming off of what you think is the apex, because it strikes me that many people in DC, but also broadly in all spheres of life, tend to skip that process. That once they lose that apex, they are so longing to get back to that sense of being at the center, being at the top, having a home, that they take a shortcut and avoid that process of reflection, introspection, of examination, of being examined by friends in the way that you're talking about. And they miss out on the opportunity to go deeper and excavate, what's behind that sense of loss. And it seems to me like if you can excavate that, you actually end up building deeper foundations for your next chapter. I mean, you talked about Churchill. Listeners of the podcast will know that I talked in the past about, over the winter break, I visited the Churchill Museum in London. Wow. And you see his paintings there. And I was struck, especially the paintings in that period that you're talking about, the post-Dardanelle fiasco paintings. And you do get a sense of somebody digging deeper through painting to get to a depth there, rather than the swirl of world events that he was so swept up into. He found an inner core and a center that I've got to believe sustained him in the second crisis of the Blitz in World War II, when events were even further spiraling out of control and seeming with great catastrophe, that he led out of that center that he had excavated in that period of exile. And it strikes me that it's a great loss if leaders, people who have had influence, skip that excavation process when they are in exile in a furious attempt to just climb back up to the apex. And do you witness that skipping, that shortcutting process in your circles?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah, I think it manifests itself in different ways. Some people, I think, spend the rest of their lives trying to kind of reach that brass ring again. I think some people just deny the loss.
Hmm.
And I wonder if that's more pronounced within the Christian world. And the reason I say that is, you may have found this too, but I think a lot of times within Christianity, people are in a way reading off of scripts, and I don't mean that cynically. I think that they're giving answers, or they're trying to live their life according to what they think it should be, rather than often what it
Yes.
is. And so I think for a lot of Christians, and friends may weigh in on this in terms of counsel, and I think depending on the facts and circumstances, this could be problematic. But it would be to say, look, we're citizens of another kingdom, and this life on this earth, is a blink of an eye. And if you're a faithful Christian, focus on Jesus, focus on the life to come, and what is not supposed to be our home. Those are all true, but they're also incomplete.
Right.
And if people feel like those human experiences, those human emotions are unvalidated, and then you feel them, but you feel like I'm not supposed to give voice to them. And if I'm a faithful Christian, it's not supposed to have that kind of hold on my heart or on my life. And when that happens, you just keep those things inside and you don't share. And then when everybody's reading off of the script, you kind of think, oh, wow, everybody else is seeing things the right way, the biblical way. And I'm not. That happens in so many different ways. I think when people talk about their experience in, reading the Bible, or quiet time, it's like they're supposed to say
Right.
how meaningful it is, rather than saying, I'm not getting anything out of this. And I just think it's important to be able to name those things in communities, and the church in particular should be a place where people can do that safely and comfortably, rather than feel like, there's this script that we're all supposed to follow.
I love that vision of giving people permission to go off script, or at least to give them scripts where loss is actually part of the
Yeah,
script, and so that they find the lines that resonate with their actual lived experience, and then
that's a
are
good
able
way
to
of
move
putting it.
forward out of that. Okay, so Peter, you were saying that the loss that you actually felt more greatly, with more sense of pain, I think, was that second loss of home, when you had to leave the Republican Party. Narrate that for us. What went into that decision? Why was it painful? And how did you go through it?
Yeah, the proximate cause for the break that I had with the Republican Party was the attraction toward, and ultimately the nomination of Donald Trump as president. So that started in the middle and late part of 2015, and certainly by 2016, the spring of 2016. And I'd been a lifelong Republican, obviously worked in 3 Republican administrations. I was in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, the George W. Bush White House. My friendships, certainly my professional friendships, were mostly, probably overwhelmingly, Republican. That was the world that I lived in, and it was a world that I defended, and the party that I defended. So Trump comes along, and he announces in middle of June of 2015, and within 3 weeks, I published a piece in the New York Times called "President Donald Trump ? Just say no," in which I warned the Republican Party that he was a serious figure to be concerned with, and he was a dangerous figure in my estimation, for the party, for the conservative cause, and for the country. Interesting backstory is that my editor is a wonderful guy, Aaron Redica. actually encountered some resistance at the Times to publish the piece. I'm a contributing editor there, um, and it was published, as I said. But some people thought, why are we publishing this piece on this guy who's a flash in the pan? You know, he's not gonna last. And I was worried about him. Just as a further context, my first piece on Donald Trump that I wrote was in 2011, called "The GOP and the Birther Trap,"
Oh,
and that was
interesting.
when
Okay. Yeah.
Trump was peddling the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, not an American citizen. And the second half of that op-ed that I had done, I basically said, don't play footsie with people who are peddling conspiracy theories. It's dangerous. It's going to come back to haunt you. Trump continues to do well. So January 2016, I wrote a piece for the Times called, I forgot what the title was, but the upshot was I would never vote for Trump under any conditions, even if he were the Republican nominee. And that bounced around, a fair amount, because I was one of the first people with sort of Republican conservative bona fides to put that stake in the ground. It wasn't, in one sense, a hard decision for me at all, Curtis. It was actually one of the easier things I've ever done in terms of the decision. It was so natural to me. I felt like I saw things in him that so alarmed me, and I thought he was so outside the norms of past presidents, that he had a sociopathy that would really do tremendous damage. I thought that was obvious, and I couldn't understand, or maybe I could understand, but I couldn't accept that the Republican Party, once he became the nominee, rallied around him. And then what was, I think, doubly painful for me was to see much of the evangelical world rally around him too, and to what in my estimation was evidence of mass hypocrisy, that the very people who in the late 1990s made character central to the requirements of a president and hit Bill Clinton upside the head with a figurative 2x4 because of Monica Lewinsky. And then along comes Trump, who makes Bill Clinton look like a Boy Scout in a lot of areas. And they just rallied around him. And that was just deeply disturbing. And I felt like I had to say something about it and call it out. In the beginning, I did it just because I was trying to use my platform to the degree I had one to warn people about it. Don't do this. This is not going to end well. You got to see who he is. He's going to hurt the things that you care about.
Yeah.
But once it became clear that they had thrown their hat over that wall, then it became a matter of calling it out as I saw it, and I'm sure I saw it imperfectly, but that was a perspective that I brought. And then the question becomes, what didn't I see about this home that I had been a part of? Was this there all along? Was I helping to build up the conditions that were created that allowed a person like Donald Trump to become president? Or in my case, I spoke out pre-Trump to what I thought were the radical and fringe elements of the Republican Party, but did I do it enough? And what does it say about the party? Has it changed? Have I changed? And then, of course, there are the relationships that become strained, because I was such an early and vocal and persistent critic, not just of Trump, but the Republican Party too, and people who I'd known and worked with, and friends of mine. And I was careful. I didn't go after friends of mine, but certainly the types that I was describing, these people fit into. So that had its challenges. It wasn't overwhelming, but there was loss to it in all sorts of ways. But I felt like I couldn't really do anything else and be true to what I thought was true and good and right in terms of this domain.
Pete, that you're describing, I think, a very profound layer of exile, which is not only do you have to deal with the loss that you feel inside yourself, but you're describing almost a loss of a memory of home. You're
Right.
having to reevaluate what you thought home was like and what you thought
Yeah.
your housemates were like and your comrades. That's a very deep re-examine. That's a very deep excavation that you have to do. What sustains you in doing that work, or having done that and also continuing to do that? What do you hold on to? How does God help you do that? Because that feels like that's a major reorientation that one has to do.
Yeah, it is a major reorientation, and people feel that happens with churches too. And in some degree, it happened with me with the sort of the evangelical movement, which is, I'd say, probably a little bit of what Maku Fujimura refers to as a border stalker. So it was never like absolutely central to me, in terms of the Republican Party, the evangelical movement. And I've always had questions. That's just the way I'm hardwired about faith and the evangelicalism. And part two, I should say one other thing too, which would be important to understand. I think my break with the Republican Party was less traumatic, less painful than it may have been for other people. For this reason, I got involved in politics because I cared mostly about ideas, not because I cared about the Republican Party per se. I wasn't a party person. I wasn't a political strategist. I just came to politics believing that ideas mattered. Those were the things that I cared about. And to me, the Republican Party was the imperfect vehicle to express those ideas. But once I came to the decision that the Republican Party not only didn't embody them, but was actually antithetical to them, I was able to break from it. So the way I put it is, I didn't cease becoming a conservative, but I did cease to become a Republican. I didn't cease to become a Christian, but I ceased to call myself an evangelical.
Yeah.
So that's there. But yeah, it's in terms of how are you sustained through it. I'd say a couple of things in my case. One is that there is a community that I have, and that grew of other people who had experienced similar things.
Fellow exiles.
Fellow exiles. And David
Yeah.
French, is a perfect example. Yeah. David, I know, has gone through it as well. So a number of my really close friends pre-Trump saw things largely the way that I did. Mike Gerson is one. David Brooks, is another. Jonathan Rauch is another. John wasn't a committed Republican or conservative, but he has conservative inclinations on a lot of issues. And there are others that I could name. So I was able to be part of a community where I didn't feel I was completely isolated or alone. So that helped. I think the other thing that helped me was if you'd have asked, Curtis, 20 or 25 people that I felt knew me best and loved me most pre-Trump, and said, in this scenario, where do you think Pete's going to end up? Do you think he's going to turn out to be a Trump defender, or do you think he's going to be a Trump critic? I think most of them would have said, I hope that he holds to his principles, at least as I see it and as they saw it, and that he would speak out against him. And they would have been disappointed if I'd have taken any other route. And mostly I would have been disappointed in myself. And I would have felt like it would have been a failure of intellectual honesty, moral integrity, and it would have been cowardly to do. That helped. And in my case, my family, my wife Cindy is very supportive. She's not particularly political, but I think she understood the threat that Trump posed. My siblings, who had all been lifelong Republicans, and we were in sync, and they all were essentially where I was. So I did have that community around me. Another thing that was really helpful to me to understand what was going on, right? Because from my perspective, and again, it's an imperfect perspective, and there are smart, honorable people who are pro-Trump and would be critics of mine, and their criticisms of me may well be fair. But I'm trying to understand why these people whom I'd been in community with, respected, whose judgment I trusted, how on what I thought was a very deep and important issue. This wasn't just some peripheral issue in American politics. I think this went in some ways to the center of our country and our political culture and our politics itself. How could they do this? And then you struggle with, do they know better? Are they being cynical about it? Are they saying one thing in private and doing something else in public? And how are they rationalizing that? And what helped me a lot was talking to clinical and social psychologists to understand how the human mind works. How do we deal with cognitive dissonance? What's the power of tribalism and community? To learn how difficult it is for a lot of people to break with their pre-existing community. How people that early on may have been queasy about Trump but supported him because they felt like his policies would do the most good for the country. And that's a perfectly legitimate argument. I didn't agree with it, but it's legitimate. But how they went from that sort of uneasy support for Trump to going all in and then defending every transgression, moral, ethical, legal that he did. And it got into sort of the us and them. And you begin to think, did I know these people? What am I missing? What are they missing? And so talking to people like Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist at NYU, author of The Righteous Mind, The Coddling of the American Mind, brilliant and wonderful human being. Learned from him. John Roush, I mentioned earlier, wrote a book recently called The Constitution, Knowledge, and Defense of Truth. So John helped me understand those aspects. And as I said, clinical psychologists that I know who help me understand things. For example, none of us lives easily with cognitive dissonance. That is, if we feel like we're at odds with who we fundamentally think we are, if we hold views or we're having actions that are at odds with what we think we are, we can't live easily with that. And something eventually has to give. And usually what happens is the mind has an enormous capacity to rationalize and justify what we do. I mean, think about, pastors who are having an affair. You probably thought, how do they have like an affair on Wednesday night and then they get up on Sunday and preach and pray and set themselves up as a spiritual authority? But then if you talk to pastors who either experienced it or who know people who have, you see how the rationalizations happen. And then, and this is the harder part, it's not only to understand how other people rationalize and justify their behavior, they're blind to they're called blind spots for a reason. You don't see them. Then you begin to think, what are mine? It's so easy to see those things in other people when it plays out, but it's really hard to see with ourselves. And that's when you need people in your life, standing in your life, and who may have a different view of things than you do, who are able to point that out to you. But it had its challenges. It wasn't overwhelming, but there was loss. It was a tough world to in some points to navigate, but it's come out pretty well, and I don't regret the position I've taken for a second.
Well, in terms of voices that help us make sense of why this happened, you listed some great voices just now. I want to bring one more voice that we began this podcast with, which is the voice of Steve Hayner, in terms of making sense of this. So, as you know, Steve was a biblical scholar, Old Testament scholar. His favorite book, Peter, do you know what his favorite book was?
Jeremiah.
Absolutely. He just loved Jeremiah. And he taught on Jeremiah, and I sat under his teaching in a course that covered Jeremiah. And one of his favorite chapters was Jeremiah 29, which is Jeremiah's letter to the exiles. And this is the letter where he is encouraging, almost in a very pastoral way, build, marry and have sons and daughters there, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what is produced there. Like, find a way to make a new home, even if it's a temporary home, in this state of exile.
Yeah.
He's very insistent that they have to learn how to tolerate this state of exile, because he says, if you don't, he gives this warning: do not let the prophets or diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams that you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. So Jeremiah is warning this impulse to resolve this uncomfort, this dissonance that you're describing of being in exile is so great. You're going to you're going to encourage leaders, prophets and diviners among you, who's going to give you delusions of how you're going to return home, how you're going to return back to the apex. And I think that's the connection is if we're not at home, if we can't figure out a way to tolerate the existence of exile, we end up wanting to resolve that by finding leaders, finding voices that tell us and give us fantasies of how we return. And I wonder if that's at least a biblical frame for making sense of what has happened, that you have large swaths of the Republican Party, which evangelicals are core to that base, that we've not taught them, and I count myself as a failure in this, we've not taught them how to make a place in exile, that they've been used to having a place of influence, cultural influence, social, political influence, and then they feel the loss of that and the dissonance of not having that anymore. And so they're prone to listening to false prophets and diviners who are giving them a diluted way to return to that. And that's happened, I think, on the mass level. And I think about all of the people that you and I have in our mind of leaders who, like Republicans, conservatives, that we think like they should have known better, that I wonder for them, their experience and their version of, they can't tolerate this sense of not being at the center, not having a home at the White House or a place that they can call home. And so they'll rationalize whatever it takes. They'll create the prophets and diviners who give them this fantasy of return to this home. What do you think about that biblical way of making sense of it?
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to read Jeremiah 29 when we're done. Yeah, that resonates with me. I think it's faithful. I think it's a faithful interpretation. You know, Mark Laverton, who was a very close friend of Steve's, and Mark just retired in the last couple of months. He was president of Fuller Theological Seminary. And he
friend of mine as well. A wonderful, amazing leader.
Yeah, he's a wonderful guy and has a wonderful pastoral heart, and it's just terrific that that whole sort of Hayner world that I got to know through Steve was just beautiful human beings. Mark gave a talk, and I think if people Google it, they can find it. I think it's called Beauty in Exile. So if you go to YouTube. And he used the framework that Maku Fujimura, I mentioned earlier, the artist, uses, which is culture care versus culture war. And Mark's speech is this idea of beauty in exile, and it's the notion of the shaping of dispositions and sensibilities in a biblical way, and how that's just profoundly different if you go into things as a person of the Christian faith, feeling like this is our land and we're going to reclaim it. It's power that we need to seize. We're going to use that power for good, and it's ours. That's one set of sensibilities. The other is that we're actually exiles in this land, and meant to be, and will always to some degree be that.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for us? And the way Mark was describing it was the capacity to lean into healing and reconciliation, repair with our enemies, so-called enemies, people we view as differently. And that he went through a whole litany of examples of what it means to be avatars of culture care, and how that healing and reconciliation is ultimately the thing that wins people's hearts and begins to heal the culture. It's not through the levers of power so much as it is, and it never has been for Christianity. If you say, well, how did Christianity go from a small group, in first century Palestine, a handful of people, by the second and third century that had swept basically the entire Western world? How did that happen? It wasn't through the seizure of political power, really any power. It was the witness of the church of being, advocates for solidarity, for caring for the least and the lost. Rodney Stark has written books on this. So have others. It was that power of that witness, which is that we're exiles, but we're going to be exiles who love in the midst of the exile, and are faithful, and are bridge builders. That is, ultimately I think the most powerful witness. I think if we as Christians get that inverted, if we think that political power is what we want and what we have to have, for one thing, it's just a false promise, because there have been times in which Christians, over the last 20, 30, 40 years have had power, and what they thought would happen hasn't happened, because life is contingent, and the political power is limited in its capacity to change culture, to change hearts and minds. But I think the more dangerous thing that happens is that, rather than sort of leavening politics, in a lot of cases, politics corrupts and disfigures the Christian faith. And without people even knowing it, Christianity becomes secondary. And Russell Moore, who's a friend of both of ours, has a phrase that Jesus is a hood ornament. That is, we take certain sort of predispositions, political, cultural, ideological, and we dress them up in Christian garb and call it Christian. Again, that's not cynical necessarily. I think people really believe that it's the proper outworking of their faith, but you can tell when that inversion happens, and it's the pursuit of power that becomes most important. And then you begin to cut corners and make compromises that really hurt the faith. So I think part of the catechesis that has to happen, you and I have talked about this before, is a proper understanding of what the role of the Christian is in culture and in politics. I think a lot of that's been lost.
Yes, I love that connection of exile as the framework for how we think we engage in the world, including perhaps especially the world of politics. I'm also thinking that not only is exile, and the scripture around exile have to be on the script now for Christians as we think about engagement in the world, but also for our own formation as human beings, as people who are following Jesus. And the reason for this is because if we adopt this biblical framework that the exile is critical for our own formation as well, right, that excavation work is for building deeper foundations for us, I'm struck by N.T. Wright's sort of understanding of the whole narrative of Scripture as actually that where Israel first thought the exile was simply the loss of their land and their political power, that what the New Testament especially opens up is that in Jesus we're understanding that exile, the real exile, is actually the power of death. That's the big exile that Jesus ends, that Jesus defeats and promises the end of that great ultimate exile. But the way that Jesus ends the exile is so strange, because in his death and resurrection, he has defeated the exile. So he's announcing there is an end to the exile, but it hasn't been completed yet. Right. We're awaiting it. And so we have to only go through that in the way that Jesus went through that, which is through death. And death is, in the Christian imagination and reality, is an exile. We are away from the body. We're not at, Paul says this in 2 Corinthians, we're not at home in the body anymore. And we await our future body. We await our future glory and body, which only comes when Jesus returns to complete the exile, to complete the end of the exile. And so that the fundamental sort of task for every Christian, whether you're in politics, whether you have had an apex in the White House or not, is we have to learn and prepare ourselves to live as people in exile, because we're all going to die. We're all going to go through that exile. And if we have not cultivated the spiritual postures and practices that enable us to tolerate going through that exile, we're in trouble, because it's only through that exile we find our way to our ultimate home in Jesus. And so this is, I think this is the challenge for Christians, not just in this political moment, but in every moment, is to learn to live as exiles.
Yeah, that's very nicely said. That's very nicely said, and theologically rich and sophisticated. That's a fascinating way to think about exile. One that uh, I hadn't I hadn't really locked in on. I'm a big fan of Tom Wright's, um, but I need to read more of his work on that.
Well, Pete, this has been just a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your story, your reflections, your hard-earned wisdom for those of our listeners who feel like they are in exile and trying to make their way and make sense of it all. You've been given a great gift to us. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Curtis, and thanks for having me on, and thanks for your ministry, Grace.
So, listeners, please know that the Good Faith podcast will return again next week. And that you should know that on February 18th, mid-February, that's when we're going to make the transition from the home, talking about homes here, the home of the Good Faith, from the Dispatch to Redeeming Babel. If all goes right, if all of our engineers are correct in telling us you listeners don't need to do anything, it will be a seamless transition. Again, what technology transition has ever been seamless? So we're hoping it'll be seamless, but that's when we'll make the transition to our home and Redeeming Babel. But until then, come back next week to your same place where you're accessing this podcast, and we'll together gather around the campfire.